Welcome all. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'm Aaron Rodrigue. I'm a professor in the history department, and it's a great honor and indeed pleasure to introduce Louis Fishman. Louis Fishman is a well-known expert on the Ottoman Empire, the Jews of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine, Israel, and modern Turkey. He's the author of numerous publications, and the author most notably of the Jews and Palestinians in the late Ottoman era, 1908-1914, Claiming the Homeland, Edinburgh University Press in 2020. He is an associate professor in the history department at Brooklyn College in the City University of New York. And his academic work focuses in late Ottoman Palestine, the Jews of the Ottoman Empire, Israel-Palestine conflict. He also is very prolific in journalism, contributes to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, wonderful, very interesting articles that I follow regularly. And he writes about Israel and Turkish politics. And he also provides political commentary in various other media outlets. And he, last but not least, he divides his time between New York, Istanbul, and Tel Aviv. Louis has graciously agreed to give 2 talks. And after this one tomorrow, I would strongly urge you to go to another talk called Polarized Democracy, a Place for Israel and Turkey. And this will be taking place in FSI.
Yeah, in the Encina, on the other side of the Encina Hall.
On the other side of Encina Hall. Anyway, it would be available online in terms of the publication. So I would strongly urge you to go there as well. And so, title. So today's talk is Late Ottoman Palestine, Jews and Palestinians between Istanbul and Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Hilda, do you want to put where's the thing under? Plugged in? But it didn't come on. So well, I'll go ahead and say, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about my work on Ottoman history, and tomorrow to talk about my work on Turkey and Israel that actually sort of emerged actually from journalism, what I'm doing tomorrow, and it has now gone into the academic realm also. You can all catch me on a very, very good time. I am on sabbatical, which is usually it's every 7 years they say, but it doesn't really work that way. It's been 10 years since I had my last break in 2013. So I'm very happy to be not teaching, which at Brooklyn College is a heavy teaching load also. It's 6 classes a year, 3, and numerous other things. We're very happy that it's a public university, and we work with most people. Almost 80-90% of the students come to Brooklyn from the neighborhood. It's a very interesting school. We have about 100 languages spoken down there, over the course of a couple of weeks. We have that many people there from different backgrounds, mostly immigrant background. So it's great, but it takes a lot of time. And this year I got an NEH to be in Jerusalem, starting in November at the Albright Institute, which usually is an archaeological institute, but now they've opened it up to history, different academics. So great, perfect. We'll go ahead and get started with the talk. Let me just do this F5, I think, do full screen, and then we can get started. Does anyone know how to do full screen? Of course, me and Hilda came and checked this out. And how do we do full screen?
Down there,
Wrong.
right
Exactly.
bottom.
It's right there,
That
right?
looks like wine glass, left.
Left, yeah, on the left.
Oh, right here, probably.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yes.
No, that's not right. Oh, it's I don't say it like that, but there. Great, very good. So today's talk is Jews and Palestinians between Istanbul and Jerusalem. So in today's talk, I will first summarize the main arguments of my book, Claiming the Homeland of Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Era. Then I will discuss some work I've done since the book that looks further into the topic. Finally, I will propose some directions I'm headed within my research. So what is the meaning of between Istanbul and Jerusalem? This is the idea that I'm developing now. I say the Young Turk era is set in a model where both Jews, locally born, children of immigrants, and Palestinians, Christians and Muslims embraced an Ottoman world where Jerusalem took on an almost like neighborhood extension of Ottoman Istanbul. And this is something that I've come across. In fact, I was explaining it to a Palestinian friend who's in Jerusalem, who comes to Turkey a lot, and I sort of am getting this feeling that it is almost like a neighborhood of Istanbul in the minds of the people. It's that close, and it's very different, I think, than other cities in the empire, if you come up Baghdad or Damascus and other places. So this is sort of the thought that I'm developing the new work. And today I added 2 new pictures because I always think you might as well have nice, beautiful pictures on there. And this one is my book. This is the newer areas, the post, the late 1800s road in the Jaffa Street going in Jerusalem, and then you have one of the old city here. And I think when I'm talking about the Ottoman world and the way the Ottomans take or perceive Jerusalem, it really is in this binary way, where you have the old city, and that's one thing, but you also have a new Jewish settlements, new Palestinian intellectuals, writers that are expanding Palestine beyond Jerusalem. And that's why I put in 2 very different pictures here. Now, the book itself is, you'll see it's the same cover I used today. And I used this cover, if we can look at the map of the district of Jerusalem. I like this when I teach, to bring it in. You see Halil Rahman, you see Jaffa Plaza, the district of Jaffa, but you don't see Tel Aviv there, you see Sarona, which was the German Christian, suddenly it escaped my mind, the Templar settlement, Sarona, which is a mall now in Tel Aviv. So it's right there, it's there, and you have, of course, most of these villages were cleansed in the post-1948 era here. They no longer exist. So maps are very important to see what was there and what's not there, so forth and so on. So the main ideas of my book was, I'll just go ahead and read these points. Following the 1908 Young Turk revolutions, Palestinians and Jews began to transform into political communities, forming distinct local identities and realizing the need to take concrete steps to claim their homeland. Now we're going to explain what that means more in a second. Importantly, Palestinians come to see themselves as a community independent of Syria, while the local Jewish community opts for separation from and not integration with the overall Palestinian population. And we're going to see this differs very much than what's happening in, let's say, Baghdad, for example, or what's happening in Cairo. By 1914, the minority Jewish community had become an independent actor, despite the growing protest of the Palestinian majority. And this book presents the history of the area within the context of the late Ottoman period and does not, when I say read history backward, by projecting the realities of today back in time. And what I've noticed a lot about history is that often we start at the point where we're at today, and we work out, we said, how did we get to this point? Well, we got to the 1948, or we got to the state of Israel because, let's go back, because of the hegemony of the Labor Party. Well, then we go back to the Holocaust, World War II, then we would go hegemony of the Labor Party, the Balfour Declaration, the second Aliyah, the first Aliyah, and so we write a very smooth narrative. But actually, if you start from the past, moving forward, you get a very, very, very different picture. Because we're going to see, and I'll mention this again, over and over again, both Jews and Palestinians could not foresee World War I was right around the corner. They could not foresee that the Ottoman state is going to cease to exist within 10 years of the period I'm writing on. So this book rethinks historical narratives. Today I'll end the talk about breaking these narratives, challenges the Zionist narrative of aliyot, the mass waves of migration, and B, it demonstrates that to understand the collapse of the Palestinian society in 1948, one needs to go back to the Ottoman era and not just the British Mandate era. It was during this period they forged their first acts of resistance, and ending, both Jews and Palestinians did not predict the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So quickly, I'll just go over the main two groups I'm looking at in the book, and then I'll look at what I'm doing now today. So in the book, I look at the two communities separately. First of all, the first chapter is a more integrative approach to it. I look at the first chapter, I bring the two groups in together, and I put forth some theoretical ideas there. But my main arguments here about Palestinian and Palestinianism. So I argue that understanding Palestinians, you need to understand them as something independent and not through the lens of the Jewish minority. So often when we're looking at the conflict, we only see the Palestinians through that lens of conflict, but we don't ever look at the fact that they were the overwhelming majority. And they had other things that interested them, they had other things that made them Palestinians. And the conflict during the late Ottoman era is something, it's a growing conflict, but it's one of many other things. So I say they are an independent factor, 85% of the population with a rich history. And then I argue that a unique Palestinian identity emerged during the late Ottoman era, not just as a reaction to Zionism. And I do a whole chapter, but I won't talk about today, about the Haram al-Sharif incident of 1911, which is an archaeological Indiana Jones type story, that when British people go and excavate in the Temple Mount, there is something very much like a near uprising there that we see Palestinians uniting. For this, it's important because it's nothing to do with the Jewish community. It has something to do with Britain, and they challenged the Ottoman hegemony here during this period. We need to treat Palestine as independent of Syria or southern Syria, which seems to be much more of a result of the idea of southern Syria needs to be, it's much more of an idea of a post-World War I reality, meaning, yes, they did see themselves as one of the districts. Today I was just reading something and it said, we're one of the districts of Vilayet of Syria. So meaning the idea that, and if you go back to the press, you'll see this over and over again. You know, Akhbar min Lebanon, news from Lebanon, news from Palestine, news from Syria, right? Well, of course, this is way before they even imagine that they're going to have independent countries, states, what these borders are going to look like. But there was this idea of regional identities. And this does not disregard the fact that they also had strong ties with the Syrian Arabs. However, for them it was clear they lived in Palestine and were increasingly referring to themselves as Palestinians. Now, Palestinian, to devise a way to explain what this is, this local identity, I use the word Palestinianism. And we could have used maybe Palestinianness also. It actually comes from me speaking Turkish a lot or Hebrew a lot and saying Filistinlik, this L-I-K or yut, the essence of being something, right? So if you don't know how to, if you're talking in Turkish and you don't want to argue about is it Palestinian identity, is it national, you said Filistinlik. It's just the essence of being Palestinian. And that's actually where I came up, because I said, wait a minute, in English I always mumble over my words saying, what am I trying to say here? Is it this or is that? But Palestinianness or ism. And Carol Hawking's book on Lebanon at the same time came out, and she talks about Lebanism, also in a very, very similar way. So Palestinianism denotes the essence of what it meant to be a Palestinian before the rise of nation-state nationalism, when the late Ottoman era, a modern notion of patriotism to Palestine began to be expressed among the local Arab population. That's what I define it as. It acted within one's identification as being Ottoman, Arab, Muslim, or Christian, and there's other ways of identity we'll see. The understanding of homeland resonated at different levels: urban notables, educated elite, village leaders, peasants, the interchange of ideas between these groups. So when I'm going back to petitions, for example, which we won't be talking about, Ottoman petitions, you know, the peasants or the muhtar of the village will say, Palestine Balad Aziza, you know, the dear land of Palestine, or Altan, you know, our Watan, different things like this. So it's coming out in different ways. It's very different when let's say when a newspaper editor decides to use it, and when a peasant uses it. But this is unique to Arab-speaking people, and I'll come back to Arab people, or not including the Arab Jews, which I'll get to in a second, who also define themselves as Arab. But this is Muslims and Christians who are defining themselves as Palestinians. Jews are not within this category, and I'll talk about that in a second. So by 1914, you get terms like Palestinian, you get Shab Palestini, you get you know, the people of Palestine, people of Palestinian origin, different ways they're defining this in the press. So Palestinians as Ottoman citizens adopt a civic approach to protest against Zionism. Palestinians transform a local identity into a viable political community inherently Arab and Ottoman. So by 1914, this is a political community. They're sending petitions, joint petitions, bringing in different classes of people. Now, when I talk about this, you know, there's an argument, and I don't know if anyone's on Twitter here, but about every other day on Twitter, they said there's no such thing as Palestine or Palestine. There's no such thing as Palestinian people. The word Palestine or Palestinian was devised in 1965 by the PLO. Has anyone heard of this? It's quite common on Twitter. It's almost every other day you see it, right? And it's a talking point, unfortunately, more and more of some pro-Israel groups, which wouldn't have been a topic 10 years ago even, or 15 years ago. You know, a lot of times these talking points are recreated, and people really believe that it didn't exist. And you say, well, then, so I brought about that there's no really big political message here. For the people reading the newspapers, they just want to understand. So I bring a classic thing of my Tuborg beer from 1911. Advertisement. Anyone that reads the newspaper Palestine every other week, every other day, it's there. It's on the last page, and it talks about if you really want a cool, great drink in the summertime, you know, you should try Tuborg beer. Now, put aside that it's very interesting that this newspaper is ran by Christians, but they also have Raqib al-Khalidi, an imam, writing religious sermons and religious content on the same page or next page over, meaning it wasn't something controversial to have it in the newspaper. Today, you wouldn't see it as such. But they say if you want to sell it in your baqal, you just contact Yusuf Alina, al-Wakil, al-Amumi, the Palestine wa Syria, right? The general distributor of Palestine and Syria. So I say it doesn't have to be, when they're using Palestine there, they're not thinking about 100 years later this is going to be a controversial term. We should put this here, right? We should put our stamp of identity on this Palestine, right? That today would be a message, right? Today, then it's just, there's no other way to say it, and obviously the people reading it. Now, where those borders start, where they stop, that's something we as historians can talk about. Then I bring this very nice letterhead from the Grand Rabbin de la Palestine, right? Harabbanut Rashid by Eretz HaKodesh, so the chief rabbi of the Holy Land, right? And then you have a nice little thing in Arabic here, Haham Pasha, Palestine, وجميع طائفة إسرائيليين سفاردين في القدس الشريف. So the chief rabbi of Palestine. It's interesting that this is one of the few times that I see them translate Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land, to Philistine. So obviously, if they have to translate this into Arabic, they're going to say who's going, these letterheads are for people that are not from within the community often, right? So they're going to have to explain what is the jurisdiction of this Grand Rabbi. So I only use this as an example that it wasn't a controversial term back then. It wasn't at all. Also for the Jews, they knew that in Arabic, if you're talking in Arabic, it would be Philistine, right? And Philistine equals Eretz HaKodesh, or the land of Israel. There's different ways. Now, Palestine's Jewish community, they do not define themselves as Palestinian Jews, but rather they refer to themselves as the Jewish community in Palestine, or better known as the Jewish Yeshuv. Defining Palestine's Jewish community is a difficult task, I say though, because you have Ashkenazi, you have Sephardi, you have immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Arab lands, from North Africa, Yiddish-speaking, Russian-speaking, Ladino, multiple dialects of Arabic and Persian. But following 1908 Young Turk Revolution, this hodgepodge of communities begin to unite under the banner of adopting Hebrew as their mother tongue. Already all the newspapers were in Hebrew, which are currently online. And this is something I think when we move to the Ottoman sources, more and more newspapers are opening up. Today we have access to this. It's very easy to get information today through these newspapers. And the Hebrew actually of Eliezer ben Yehuda, Hatzvi, is much more difficult to read than HaCherut, which is much more seemingly straightforward Hebrew that's used today. So this idea, yes, Hebrew was being revived, but even someone like David Ben Gurion, who I'll get to in a second, all the documents I have of his in Istanbul are written in Hebrew. Okay, he knew how to read and write Hebrew fluently, and I think that's something important. Now, did he learn this as a child in the Cheder or later on? That I wouldn't be able to answer. I haven't done enough to study it. But Hebrew is very dominating in Jerusalem and Jaffa. That should be very important to point out. It's very different than other places within the Ottoman Empire. The adoption of Hebrew connects Zionists and anti-Zionists into one group. As we will see, anti-Zionism does not correlate to what it is in the post-World War I era. And when we talk about someone like Albert Entebbe, I'll bring him up in a second, he's fluent in Hebrew. And in fact, when the Ottoman governor visits Petah Tikva, he speaks in French, and Albert Entebbe translates it to Hebrew for the local Jewish population who are immigrants to understand. Okay, so it is a bit mind-boggling when you're going back to these documents. Now, Jewish community adopts Ottoman patriotism. This is a central point of my book, and I call it separation through integration, which was common among other non-Muslim groups, and inherently it was strengthened by the spread of Hebrew as a dominant language of the Yeshuv. So I'll come back to this about separation. Separation through integration, I'll come back to that. A local Zionism emerges during this period, not just in Jerusalem, but also in Istanbul, other cities throughout the empire. Youth attracted to Zionism, Ottoman Jewish politicians in Istanbul influenced by Zionism also will come to this. I've developed this since the book came out. And the Israeli historical narrative has written out the history of the Ottoman Zionism period. This is very important. I'll come back to this idea that at the very end of today's talk. Now, the last thing about the book, and then I'll go ahead and move on to some of the newer things that I'm doing. So I come up with this idea, what I call renegotiating the Millet system. Following the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, a euphoric response of a new era emerged. Jews, Christians, and Muslims celebrate together in Jerusalem, as well in Istanbul and other cities throughout the empire. This book challenges nostalgic descriptions of intercommunal relations, much found in the press, but it does not discredit previous work showing these different relations, but uses their work as a launching point to ask what was the meaning of these relations. And I argue that the words musavat and riyat, freedom and equality, was not a horizontal type of equality, but one that provided an equal playing field. So young Turks' transfer of power to a secular elite enacted something where each community would now renegotiate demands vis-a-vis the new bureaucratic Istanbul elite. So what's happening here basically? They say, great, we now have equality. Jews, Christians, Muslims, the Armenian community, the Greek community, the Jewish community, they're all able to be equal citizens now. And they took it very, very seriously. They started talking about, we're going to join the army, we're going to be equal citizens. But that actually starts a dynamic that equality is vis-a-vis the Istanbul Muslim elite. Meaning it's them giving them that equality, it's each community not talking, they're interacting, looking at each other and saying, wait a minute, let's learn from this. But really, it's the Jewish community vis-a-vis the CUP, Community of Union and Progress, it's Armenians via the CUP, and both the Jewish community and the Armenians are part of the CUP in this period, and the Greek community. So I say the Ottoman Jewish community, whether in Palestine or Istanbul, was using other non-Muslim communities as a model to receive what we finally got to the word, autonomous rights. So the Varkas Effendi, who was killed in 1915 in the genocide, he quotes, "Freedom of language more than anything will show the people of the empire that the Ottoman flag is the best shelter for the national freedom, and this feeling will unite everyone together and will link everyone with the greatest patriotism to the Ottoman homeland, and will enlighten everyone together to love the flag and always defend it." So this gives you an idea that by adopting an Ottoman identity, you were able to also separate into your own little compartment and think about what that meant to be a Jew, Armenian or Greek during this period. Now, yes, very good. So this is, I think, on a timer or something. 1 second. Yes. So this is the new work that I'm coming up with, and he's my book also, Karmi Effendi. He was the first Jewish officer in the Ottoman army, was the son of Aaron Eisenberg, the founder of Rehovot. He ends up dying in World War I as a POW. After the war was over, the exchange of POWs happens late. He dies in Russia, where his father came from. And here is we now have, via what I was using with Mutaferrika, if anyone knows, they opened up all these sites, and now you have to have a university by the subscription. But we have, for the first time, search engines in Ottoman language newspapers. And it's brilliant. So you put, when it was open, you put Zionism, boom, you get 50 articles that are nothing about it in my book. I had no idea that this existed. Anyone that's worked with Tanin in the Atatürk Library knows that sometimes it has this little sheet of wax paper over top, or at least it did in those days. It was very hard to read. The Ottoman archives we can talk about later if you have questions, what I found and what I didn't find. But I asked about, so we have some of the Osmanlılık için. And these are, this is about actually Jewish Zionists coming from Palestine to fight in the Balkan Wars. They're at the law school in Istanbul, and the Tanin newspaper is very interested in saying, who are these people that some of them aren't even Ottoman citizens? They're Zionists and they want to fight for us. Of course, they say that's good, right? That's something good. So I write, can we imagine an Ottoman Jewish homeland in Palestine that breaks out the mainstream Zionist narrative of Aliyot, the immigration, the first immigration wave, the second wave that goes up all the way up to 1948, which has led to the misconception that a Jewish state in Palestine was inevitable. And I think this is really what we have a hard time grappling with. That, as we'll see here later on, they were completely happy during this period, almost across the board, of saying we can have an Ottoman Jewish homeland in Palestine without independence. Right? This wasn't something big. There were debates about it, and we can talk about the extent. Now, I didn't include in my book, because every other person has included it on Twitter and Facebook and 1,000 times, of David Ben Gurion and Moshe Sheret in Istanbul with the fezzes. But it does really break your imagination. You see the first prime minister, the first foreign minister, the second prime minister, Moshe Sheret, in Istanbul studying. Moshe Sheret is very interesting because he actually, I believe, had the Ottoman citizenship. Ben Gurion did not, as far as I find, did not get Ottoman citizenship, which is interesting. Many of them did. But Moshe Sheret in 1919 in the archives, Ottoman archives, he comes back to pick up his grades from the Hukuk faculty, from the law thing. And where does he go out? Where does he take those grades? He hasn't finished his degree yet. Does anyone want to guess? No? This is the time to drink. To London. He says, I'm going to go to study in London now. The Ottoman era is over. It's under British control. Now I'm going to there to study, right? So it's a huge switch in the mind. I don't know that's what the document says he's going. I haven't really followed up on this. And here is you have different documents that we see. We have about the Agudat Mitlamdim Ha'ivrim Ha'Uthmanim Bakushta, the Society for the Hebrew students in the Ottoman in Istanbul, and we have a company that's started up by Gad Frumken and Aaron Eisenberg. So this is them working in Istanbul. Now, so on one hand we have Zionists coming there, but we already have something very interesting that's happening here, and this is why I've been developing much more, is I'm looking at, there's about 5 or 6 Ashkenazi settlements in Asia Minor. So we have Or Yehuda, we have Mesilah Chadashah. I'll talk about Mesilah Chadashah in a second. But these are modern Hebrew-speaking communities in Anatolia, founded by the Jewish Colonization Association. So we'll be coming back to them. I visited Or Yehuda today. You see Or Yehuda now. Anyone knows Or Yehuda? That's a place about a 20-minute drive from Tel Aviv. The first Or Yehuda was actually in Akhisar, about 3 hours from Istanbul, from Izmir. And I visited there, and you actually have the old schoolhouse right there, which I was able to break in through the fence. It was a farming school for Jews coming from the farming school in Palestine also, joining other Jewish students there, and other different groups of people that were studying there. And they've done, I did an article about the memory of Jews where they don't exist anymore in Turkey. Something I did, I published about 2 years ago. You can find that, and I went back and it was saying, how do Turkish people today preserve the memory of Jewish communities where they don't exist? Meaning I'm not looking at the urban areas, I'm looking at rural areas, Bergama, mostly Western Anatolia, Akhisar. And what you see is that they actually preserve the graveyard now. The graveyard has been, if you looked at it 20 years ago, it was in complete ruins. And today it's cleaned up, there's grass, and there's just a small little fence around it, very close to the cemetery there. So this led, the founding of Mesilah Chadashah was a Jewish farming community about 3 hours from Istanbul, which today is Sultan Beyli. And then it was 3 hours on horseback. Today it's 3 hours in traffic to get there. And Sultan Beyli is interesting because the local municipality actually printed a book about the history of the municipality, and they included probably one of the first extensive research, they printed research that had already been done in Turkish about Mesilah Chadashah and the Jewish farmers that used to live there. So there's many things different, interesting about this. After World War I, it becomes a training camp to go to Palestine. Yusuf Trumpeldor was also there worked there. Anyone that knows Zionist history will know what I'm talking about. But in another source I have from a picture, it said kibbutz, a kibbutz in Turkey or Istanbul, right? So this idea, that's when it was already as a training camp. We're not going to read this whole thing right here, though. This is from 1904, and this is when someone from the Times in London, they take a trip across Anatolia, and they document it, and they come across, along the railway line between Eskişehir and Ankara are situated 3 small colonies of Jewish refugees from Romania, who, like their Spanish Jews in the Middle Ages, have found, they end up taking refuge there. And there's about 100 families. And there's almost no memory of these places today. Interesting enough, the person that finds them is Otto Warburg, who was working on the railway, the railway there, and he becomes the Zionist president in 1913. Okay, so we're going to come back to him. And then they talk about this. It's very interesting that the colonists share everything. And it's really describing almost what they call it today a moshav in Israel. They have some private, but most everything's owned by the whole community. And that's how they're promoting their lives there. So it could be that, the first kibbutz or moshav was actually in Anatolia. And you have a picture of these farmers. Much like the settlements in Palestine, which we haven't talked about today, many of them were unsuccessful. Also, and when their Masilah Hadashah was not a success, and that brings Zionists in Palestine saying, wait a minute, what happens, and this is, it was published by an article in Hebrew about 20 years ago. I found the documents, but they said, what happens if we create Zionist settlements in and around Istanbul? Okay, we raise a whole generation there. You can see, I'll read the quote and then I'll move quickly towards the end of the talk. The main thing is that a land settlement in Turkey outside the land of Israel will strengthen our political position and advance our work in the land of Israel. We will prove to the government by our deeds that we do not have any foreign thoughts before us, and we do not intend to concentrate and fortify in one part of the country. And if several colonies are established around the capital, that's Istanbul, and the government will closely discuss the benefit that will come to the country from our good intentions and loyalty, it will certainly remove the obstacles it has placed before the land of Israel, and we'll be able to think of its extensive help and support of the government. The government is not against Jewish settlement in Palestine on the condition that Jews also settle in other places. And this is an extension at the same time of what Otto Warburg is talking about, saying that, wait a minute, maybe the confinements of settlements should be outside of Palestine also. This fits conspiracy theories, you could argue, but really what it's talking about is that they believe that the Ottomans are going to be there for decades, forever. They don't see this. Now, there are other Zionists that come against this and they do not approve this plan. It was really divided between a fight between Zionists in Palestine. Do we diversify it, or do we keep it only focused on Palestine? Now, I have about 10 more minutes. Is that fine on time? So now we're looking at the latest work. I did an article the article was called Arab Jews Between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim, I believe that's the article. But I put Arab Jews and Sfaradim between Istanbul and Cairo. So we do have, there's no doubt that there is also a debate now in the Twitter spheres and TV debates. There's no such thing as an Arab Jew. This is just you trying to promote politics and different things like this. No, it was very interesting that in 1911, 1912, you get people such as Nissim Mandul, Shimon Moal, Esther Moal, Avram El Meliach, and Albert Entebbe. You get them quotes from in the Jewish paper, the Jewish press, calling themselves things like Ivrim Arabim, Hebrew Arabs, Yehudim Arabim, Jewish Arabs. There's different ways that they're expressing this. So I say the Sephardic Jews and the Arab Jews alike saw themselves positioned in the perfect place to progress Zionism within Palestine and the Ottoman lands at large. Now, my work counters the work of previous scholars who claimed that the Sephardim were closer to the Palestinians because they were Arab Jews, basically, such as Shimon Moel or Nissim Malul. They started an organization called Hamagin, and I argue it's very clear from the press that it was aimed at silencing the Palestinian press. And often we look at Esther Moyal. Some work has been done on her, saying that maybe because of what the Israeli, a lot of the Israeli and other historians of the Mizrahi Jews often see the oppression that the Mizrahi Jews faced in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and they apply that back to the Ottoman period. And I'm only talking about in Palestine right now, okay, where this is the backbone of the Jewish Yishuv is a large community of Arabic-speaking Jews. They're present in the press, they're present in the politics. They are, you can't take them outside of that community. Now, do they have their differences? Yes. Do they get along? Not always. Do they recognize each other's importance? Absolutely. Do they debate each other in the press? Absolutely. So I look at them and I say Esther Moyal, she was very different because she didn't know Hebrew. And she was a woman. And there was almost no representation of women in the local press, and it's very different than in Cairo, where they were all very big. Nissim Malul was born in Palestine, raised in Egypt, and was a prolific writer in Arabic in Cairo. So was Shimon Moel and Esther Moel from Lebanon, represented in the 1880s in the World Fair. Lebanon, she's a prolific writer already and well-known figure. So that space for women didn't exist, at least in the public sphere during this period. In Palestine, it was much, much more a conservative place. Now I look at Abraham el-Maliach, who was, of North African background, born in Palestine, and when Chaim Nachum comes to visit, the chief rabbi comes to visit, he says, you know what, I'm quitting my job in HaChirut, I'm going to Istanbul, where I'm going to be the chief rabbi's assistant. There he founded the Maccabi clubs, sports clubs, and then he says, I'll go to Damascus only if they let me teach Hebrew in Damascus, because they are the real Arab Jews and they don't know Hebrew. So this debate of Arab Jews also comes up with Damascus Jews. Other people I look at, this is more for people that are within the debate, are Albert Entebbe. He was a staunch anti-Zionist. He was staunchly pro-Jewish immigration to Palestine. You have Chaim Nachum, the chief rabbi, a staunch anti-Zionist who he ends up, leaving and the modern, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish state, he becomes the chief rabbi in Egypt. He never goes to Israel. And he remained anti-Zionist. But in this period, he was very pro-Jewish immigration. So, and the fact is, this is the Palestinians, which in a second I'll come back to them, they see this right away. And they counter all three of these people that have been written into history as being closer to Palestinians. The Palestinian press says, no, they are Zionists. We have to treat them as such. And even if they are Arabs, we have to recognize that we are head on with each other on this. So that's why I say, why could they exist in Cairo and not in Palestine? Simply because in Cairo, the nationalism that was emerging in Egyptian nationalism during this period was a civic nationalism. And the idea that Jews could be Egyptians, Christians, Coptics, whatever, everyone could be Egyptian, and it was something very well accepted. And for them, Zionism was an expression of their Jewish patriotism or their connection, very much like Istanbul. Now, quickly, Zionism is a movement of modernization. We see during this period in Istanbul, the work I've done on it with in the new search engine, Filistine Sionisler, Malum der ki Yudiler, Duninin Mutaraki Aleph, We know that the Jews are the most advanced people in the world. What are they going to do to Palestine? They're going to bring progress to Palestine. That's something very, very evident in the press. You do have debates, and we'll come to that in a second, but it's over something very different. And we have the visit of Mufti Bey in Rishon LeZion that I talked about, and being very impressed by the Zionists. Now, Palestinians, the Palestinian parliamentarian, the press are very worried about this. They're writing about this. They're saying, what's going on? The Ottoman government, how can he go to Zionist settlements and say what he's saying? This is a threat to our homeland. That's why I say that they're placing claim over the homeland. And Mufti Bey, very interestingly, becomes in 1936, I believe, the Prime Minister of Albania. So he was of Albanian origin that serves the Ottomans in Jerusalem, and years later he becomes Prime Minister of Albania. Now, within the Ottoman elite, the question of Zionism turns into one that's inherently, the anti-Zionism argument, inherently connected to conspiracy theories. And I said it almost has nothing to do with Palestine. So Palestinians are often non-existent in the debates on Zionism, and this frustrates the Palestinians. Over and over they say, first of all, they have a problem. They are, the ones that are with the CUP, they are being blamed for being on the side that have fallen to Jewish conspiracy. So I look at two groups in Istanbul. This is something new coming out in the next 6 months. I look at Abu Ziyad Tawfiq, who's a known anti-Semitic person within the Ottoman Muslim elite. He writes in the 1880s already anti-Semitic texts, and he goes on and spreads this idea. This is his publication, Zionism Tehlikleri, the dangers of Zionism, and it's about world conspiracy. But then I found Reza Bey Tawfiq, who is a devout Zionist for the first couple of years. A Muslim parliamentarian says, you know what? This is just their patriotism. Reza Bey Tawfiq studies, and Jake, you're also working on this very similar article, and Reza Bey, when he was from Edirne. And I believe his father went to Alianza Israelite or worked at the school, so he also spoke Ladino. Apparently, he spoke like 15 languages.
He himself went to an Alliance.
Oh, he went to Alliance, yeah, exactly. He himself went to it. So it's really interesting to see this debate among these two Tawfiqs about what Zionism is. And then you have the very big Ali Kamal, who is sort of promoted today as one of the few intellectuals that really sort of, you could argue, recognized the Armenian genocide very early on, ends up being killed, in a terrible way by pro-Kemalist forces. And we didn't even know about this up until about a year and a half ago. I was reading the Jewish Chronicle article that said, wait a minute, they talk about Ali Kamal being anti-Semitic. I put it in the Hebrew press. From the Hebrew press, I found it in the Ottoman press, and I found out that he wrote many articles talking about Karaso Effendi, the head of the Jewish MP, as being behind the overthrow of Sultan Abdulhamid II. So I ask ourselves, we always thought from Eli Kaduri's article decades ago that this was the British consul that spread these ideas. Now I'm saying to myself, we don't know really who started this. Maybe it was the British consul person reporting this only. It was everywhere. It was, they clamped down this. Just two more slides. The Ottoman Jews, between anti-Semitism and patriotism, the same moment when this is happening, where in the sphere of the Jews in Istanbul and all over the empire are becoming proud Ottomans. This is Mordechai Bey Effendi in the middle. This is in the press of a Jewish soldier and joining to go fight. They took his picture and they put it up in one of the local Istanbul newspapers. And I say, as a debate of conspiracy theories take over, Ottoman Jews will have less space to maneuver. I argue that by the early years of the Republic, they are still burnt by this fear that the moment that they got 7 seats or 6, 7 seats in the parliament, and it became so debated about the conspiracy theories, Jewish takeover, that it really set the path for their place within the republic. Now, Palestinians from Jerusalem to Istanbul, this is stuff I'm going to start working on now. I really want to look at Ruhi al-Khalidi, the Palestinian MP from Jerusalem. He joins a trip, a pro-Zionist trip to London in 1909. He's with Riza Tawfiq, he's with Nissim Mazliat, the MP from Izmir. And I have to, and Ruhi al-Khalidi is a staunch anti-Zionist. He understands, remember the Palestinians already, his uncle or far family member was Yusuf Dieh Khalidi, who already says the first parliamentary member from Jerusalem in the first parliament. And he says, take note of these, they're serious. They are going to, they're going to be able to get a Jewish homeland in our land. What's important to understand is that Palestinians already, politicians, different places, understand that the Zionists might succeed in their ability to get the homeland there. That once again does not always have to look like an independent state that's growing hegemony, which I've been talking about. So I'm going to look at more. I'll be visiting in Jerusalem the Khalidiyya Library. I hope to get. I know he has memoirs. I hope to try to find out more about his ideas about this. They are aware of the pro-Zionist sentiments in Palestine. They have to work between cordial relations and expressing dismay. This is very frustrating for them. On one hand, they're Ottoman citizens. Many of them are pro-government. Many of them are in the same Mason lodges that are, Jews, Muslims, Christians in the same Mason lodges. These same Mason lodges are being blamed for these anti-Jewish conspiracies connected to the Masons. And Palestinians watch closely events in Istanbul, countering Zionist claims in terms of the pro-Ottoman stance. Palestinians were supported the same government that was being accused of being Zionist. And this is really coming to the end. Why were the Palestinians more pro-CUP than Syrians? I don't know the answer, and I've never really got that answer. And I'm hoping to, the more I've read over like a year and a half of Philistine, and I see that they are suspicious of the Selanik group within the CUP. So the idea was that the Selanik group was these people that were connected to Karaso and different people. So I see this now in the press, which we don't have search engines also for the Philistine. You have to basically read everyone. Now, and I want to discover more about what are the Palestinian youth clubs I talk in my book. You have Philistine Gençleri in Istanbul, the Palestinian youth, you have the Palestinian youth in Cairo, you have them in Beirut and in Damascus, and you have them in Jerusalem where they're the Jerusalem youth. So what are these groups especially? Now just to conclude, due to nationalist narratives, we have erased a great part of the histories of the post-Ottoman states. Today I have addressed this point in relation to Zionist and Israeli history, which labor Zionism and its success dictated, meaning the labor Zionists dictated the history of the Zionist history or the history of the land of Israel or Palestine. And where there were no successes, they created them or overemphasized them. So we have on one hand the Israeli historiography that is pretty much molded, and it's very hard to chisel down it. Post-Balfour Declaration, Arab histories have written out the complexities of the different regions of Syria, ignoring local identities, and also strengthening the notion that Palestine was a place where local Jews, Christians, and Muslims all identified as Palestinians. So we hear this over and over again, that before Zionism, they were all Palestinians. Everyone, there was sort of this like great unity between them. And I explained in the article I read why that is, what that notion, where does that emerge? Turkish history has also written over layers of Ottoman history, like Jewish and Palestinian history. Much of the realities in the past are now accessible within the press, with many newspapers online. So really, I think the more and more these newspapers open, the more and more history we'll be able to write. Of course, it's very limited. There's many more documents have been opened up since I was in the archives, over 15 years ago, on Palestine. Many of these documents are online now. Meaning, during COVID, anyone that had a devlet, the Turkish citizen, could go in and they could get access to libraries and they could download, tons of documents. So these are documents many of them we haven't seen. So it'd be really interesting to develop this. So I asked, where do we go from here? I leave that for you all to think about. And with that, I think I'm finished, and I'm sorry I went over time.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. We'll take questions. Yes.
Since the beginning, there has been an emphasis on Jews being different than Palestinians. And you said that following the Turkish Revolution, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, when you said that, you switched codes to saying Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Palestine, so like this in Jerusalem. But then you said that there was Egyptian Jews, there was Arab Jews, but you never mentioned that there was Palestinian Jews, but like the wording. And you said that in Cairo, Zionism was seen as an expression, and it was kind of supported. But Egypt was one of the countries that sent the most troops to Palestine to fight the Nakba in 1948. So why is there such a distinction in your talk between Jews and Palestinians, as if they cannot be one, when Golda Meir, one of the Israeli prime ministers, said in an interview, I am Palestinian, I was Palestinian, there was no Israel before 1948.
So the I am a Palestinian is the post during the British Mandate where they are, everyone is Palestinians, and often even during this period, if you're going abroad, outside of Israel, you're going to say, I went to Palestine, For example, the Palestinian identity, Palestinians, when they went to New York, I forget the person right now who has his diaries published. He ran for parliament also in 1913, a Christian man, not from the elite families. He says, I'm Syrian in his diary, right? And I think that is who you're talking to, and so that's that. But so the British era mandate, she was, according by the thing, she was Palestinian. We know how she used that, and the stupidity and using it to deny Palestinian existence, right? She used it. If you get back to the question about the Ottoman period, during these years already, the Palestinian Jewish community, because it's not united in one community, makes it complicated, because you have so many different communities, and they're there because it's the Holy Land. That's why they're there. That's why their families emerged there. They have different yeshivas, they have different... People said, oh, they spoke Arabic. I said, yeah, they spoke Arabic, but they didn't. They spoke their own dialects. They spoke the Mughrabi dialect, or they spoke the Yemeni dialect, or they spoke... That didn't connect them closer to Palestinians. Now, a lot of work has been done. Really good work, and that's why I'm saying I'm not saying what the work that's been done is not correct. Where they lived in the same neighborhoods, they interacted, they lived in the same. Sometimes they shared. They had shared homes, they different shops. There's testament to that. They celebrate holidays together often. But the minute it starts becoming sort of this political thread in it, that really separates them. Because you can be a proud Egyptian. And the fact that in 1948, that's a question for Egypt, right? Why did this civic nationalism transform into Arab nationalism, right? Or sort of a greater Arab nationalism, right? At what point does this, you have Abu Nadarat, I forget his name, the man with the glasses, right? Do you know? What's that? Yeah, Yaqub Sunua, that when he dies, in Hebrew they write great things. And Nissim Mandul, he said he was my favorite person. He was an Egyptian Jew, that he's one of the people that said Egypt for the Egyptians, right? He was expelled during the in the 1880s from Egypt, went to Europe and went to write. So Jews were finding a place, and someone here, and I can't talk about Iraq because someone here that knows Iraq more than most people is here, right? But they could integrate into here. I will tell you that in the Turkish case, because they're Ladino speakers, it was easier to adopt this sort of, renegotiating the millet system. In my idea, that transition to Turkish nationalism or becoming Turkish, right, was a very hard process. In Cairo, the far majority of the people I'm talking about are Arabic speakers. They're speaking the same dialect or close dialect to the people. They're going to the same schools. They're integrating. Even if they go to Jewish school, they might meet each other in universities. So that's the why. In Palestine, it's very small. We're talking very, very small. The Jewish community is maybe 100,000. And by 1908, first of all, most of the Arabic-speaking Jews, what I found, Nissim Madou says there's 5 Jews that can write Arabic well. He says we can count them of intellectuals, right? Anyone that can write. They're talking about South al-Osmaniya, this newspaper. They're going to start an Arab newspaper. That was for Zionist propaganda, clearly. But they said we need Arabs to be writing it. We need it because we're not enough to write in Arabic. Even though they spoke Arabic, that Arabic that they knew was written in Hebrew characters often, Judeo-Arabic. Okay, so that's sort of, I hope that I answered. And the Palestinians, because they know that they're Zionists, are not going to say, they're not going to have this, I'm going to use this love fest, this idea of everyone coming together and saying like, let's all join, because they know that they are inherently separating. Now these Arab Jews said, no, Zionism is not going to affect you. Zionism is going to help you. It's going to bring progress to the land and there's going to be development. And everything I can see, they didn't accept it. There were Palestinians that did accept it. There were, you would hear them, but there's a unified voice saying that we're worried about what's happening here. Very, very worried. And they voiced it over and over again.
Thank you so much, Lee, for sharing your work and your thoughts with us. I have 2 questions, but maybe we can start with one. When an Ottoman statesman like Reza Tevfik declares himself a Zionist or a supporter of Zionism, what do you think he means? What's his definition of Zionist and Zionism?
Yeah, it's actually this post-Young Turk idea of patriotism. And he looks at the other communities, and I think he says, well, we have Turkish nationalism, they have Armenian nationalism, they have Greek nationalism, or love of their people. So what do the Jews have? And that could be Zionism. Now, it's not just him speaking, it's Nissim Mazlian, the MP, he prides himself that more Muslims voted for him than Jews did in Izmir. Originally from Salonika. He runs in Izmir, and he says, I'm a Zionist, in the sense that Jews can live all over the empire, and we're going to have Hebrew in the kindergarten, and then Turkish also. Hebrew and Turkish together. So we're going to bring them up as proud Turkish speakers, but also have that Hebrew component. Okay, so he didn't, remember all the Ottoman Zionists really veer away from the settlement in Palestine. They say, we're going to create, and that's why it's more of a sort of a culture, what we call cultural Zionism, this idea of love of the homeland. Now remember, the Ottomans are ruling over that Ottoman Palestine. So to be a Istanbul Jew, which we have our anti-Zionists yesterday. We're talking about David Fresco of El Tiempo, who is one of the few anti-Zionists that mirrors today's anti-Zionism closest. He is non-compromising on this issue. Non-compromising. This is going to hurt Ottoman Jews. And I think, and I would have to go and read his stuff much more, but what is his idea of Jewish migration to Palestine? I think he wouldn't have been at all for it. At all. Yes.
If I may
Yes, please.
add to that. It adds to the question. David Fresco's argument, but also which mirrors, in fact, anti-Zionists throughout, also influenced to some extent Zionists, which is that his argument is not only this as an impossibility or as utopian or whatever, but there's a fear element, which is, and he says it explicitly in his tract in Medina, which was then translated to French, when he's debating Sokolov who was in Istanbul at the time. When he's debating, he's saying, you can see what is happening to other people who have national aspirations, i.e. the Armenians, there's already the 1890s have gone by and whatever, and there's very much a fear element of let's not create another nationalities problem in the Ottoman Empire. And I wonder, and that led on to my question that I was going to ask, which is, to what extent this whole, I mean, I'm not saying that these Zionists that you're talking about, this is a homeland, but they don't want independence. That certainly is, I mean, it's a thing on its own. But weren't there also debates of like, well, but if we ask for independence or if we want a separatist kind of thing right now, look at what's happening to the empire, which has been threatened by so many separatist movements, has lost so many things. We are going to get into trouble if we overtly do this. So there is a kind of a realpolitik angle of the homeland. We don't want anything else. So there is so in that respect, Fresco's argument could feed in to the muting of the separatist by the Zionists. I mean, and there is debate on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what this latest thing I was writing about the sort of history of Zionism and the Ottoman history is that after Theodor Herzl dies, it's only about Israel Zangwill leaves the Zionist movement, and then he searches out for a Jewish homeland in Iraq. There's a lot of confusion when the debates of Zionism when they're talking about the homeland in Mesopotamia, right? That's the idea of buying land for Jews. Abu Ziyad Tawfiq first debates Moses Cohen over this settlement of Jews over Iraq, and not in Palestine. And this even gets more attention than what's happening in Palestine. It's really mind-boggling, Abu Ziyad Tawfiq, that he talks about the Iraq issue, he doesn't talk about Palestine so much. That deserves its own questioning. Yes, I think after Herzl dies and after Zangwill leaves for territorial ideas, is that, and especially with Otto Warburg coming at the head of the Zionists, who knows the Ottoman Empire, knows the Jewish settlements in Anatolia, is that they come to the terms that it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, and that's where you have this merging together of political Zionism, and what they call practical Zionism. And the two merge together, and they really, that's when Arthur Rupin comes in. Arthur Rupin, right, is always with the Ottoman governor next to him. So yeah, I think you're right. There were certainly the ones that said, we want independence, we want to, and they're the ones that said, no, we're not going to promote a Jewish, bringing Jews to Istanbul is not going to help us at all in the long run. They're going to become local Ottoman Jews there, and they're not going to help us. And the idea is, I think that we had this, of course, you know more than I did, before the dichotomy of the, Sephardic Jews are anti-Zionist. Right. They're all anti-Zionist. They don't believe in this. Exactly. And then we see the Maccabi clubs. Yeah. So what about the Maccabi clubs are pretty widespread, and now you can look up, just write Maccabi Istanbul, you get a whole great photography of their meetings in Istanbul in the late Ottoman era. It was really, really extensive, and they had B'nai Brit there, and they had different things like this. This stops in the Republican period. This idea in the Republican period that they can't have this anymore, and this is going to lead to their leaving eventually, right? Which is we mentioned briefly tomorrow in a very different way. Yeah. So I hope I answered that.
You had another question. Sorry, I hope I.
And then the second, my second question was, since Louis, you're so enmeshed in sort of putting some of these developments regarding Jews in Palestine in the Ottoman context. I wonder if you have come across much sort of language about the muhajir phenomenon. Muhajir, which is often a term used to describe the mass migration of Muslims, but and it has a slightly more specific definition in the Ottoman context of basically people leaving formerly Ottoman lands that are lost and coming toward the center of the empire. And I wonder if you have seen sort of that discourse used to describe Jews, and because you mentioned Romanians, you know, I would often think when I would look at these sources, okay, Romanian Jews, Russian Jews, same difference, Ashkenazim, but actually there's a key difference that technically a Romanian Jew who comes to anywhere in the Ottoman Empire could be called a muhajir because they're leaving a formerly Ottoman land.
Absolutely. And muhajir has a whole context of resettlement in the Ottoman Empire. If you're a Muslim muhajir, right, you can be resettled in the Ottoman Empire. They're going to give you a plot of land. The only place that happened to was that article I showed you of the Eskişehir community. They were Jews that said, we do not want to be under Russian Empire control. We want to be, we're suspicious of them. We want the Ottomans to give us a plot of land, and they give them that plot of land in Eskişehir. This is one of the 3 settlements right there that Warburg finds, and they're destitute, and they're having a hard time settling in. They're muhajirs, and they're also called, another place I've seen them called muhajirs. I actually wrote about this one question in this only case. Now, very importantly, why are they talking about Jewish settlement? Riza Tevfik Bey, I did mention this and other people. They're saying, one, and I didn't bring this up, Jews can counter the Greek threat. We can bring a mass amount of Jews into the empire, into the heartlands, to counter the Greek threat. Riza Tevfik is saying these Jews are going to hurt Greeks, perhaps also, set off an imbalance between these two groups. They're also looking at, remember at this moment, you have many Ottomans, both Turks, Arabs, Armenians, leaving the homeland for the Americas. So you're going to need someone to be proud farmers in around, especially around Silivri, for example. They're buying, there's land for sale, and they say, wait a minute. Somehow, Russian Jews read about it in a newspaper, and they're going to buy that land. And a lot of Ottomans say, like Masriya Padishah, they say, this is good. We're going down in production, food production. We need people, farmers, modernity, because so many people are leaving. Now, let me say the fact that so many people are leaving is why Palestinians also feared Zionism to a great extent. They said, we're leaving and they're coming. That was always, and I never, that was probably the most confusing thing to me. Because I said they're always talking about migration. And then the late Boutros Abomani, who was my professor in my undergrad, I brought him a document. He says, you don't understand what they're saying. They're talking about the Arabs leaving the land and the Jews coming, right? So that was also motivating others to say, not in the idea of muhajir, that these ideas, some of the Jews were saying, why not have it a little ring around Istanbul? We can get a train from Russia to here in 8 hours. Why send them all the way to the United States? There's going to be the ones that will just come here. So, and by then you have a school, you have schools in Aydin, you have Akhisar, you have Bergama. These disappeared by 1948. By 48, these disappeared. All these small settlements. And Banderman, you also have a settlement. They almost completely disappeared. Yeah.
So, I'm working mostly on Jews who are like staunchly anti-Zionist, so I'm trying to wrap my head around your guys. So, I was wondering first, like within this kind of Ottoman framework, how do they feel about sort of the 2 pillars of the movement? One is settlement, buying land and so forth, and secondly, the indigenous population. So they have this vision of shared citizenship, or they have some hierarchies, and then within the Zionist movement.
So you're talking about the
sort of the Zionists that see themselves within an Ottoman framework.
okay, yeah.
And then those kind of Ottoman Jewish Zionists, like how much are they? What is their role in the movement? Because we also have Jabotinsky, we also have people who are working with the English. Jewish during World War I. We have the kibbutz movement, we have the resistance to the Uganda plan, so there's also something that is very sort of pro-settlement. And I think, just as a comment, if you read the Arabic press, there is much more an immediate sense of peril than perhaps in the Ottoman press.
Mhm.
And so, you know, the challenging that Malul gets in Al-Muqtata, where they write, you know, the Zionists are going to develop the land. They're getting letters that say, thank you, but no thank you in Arabic. Georgi Zaidan, a very famous intellectual that Malul worked with, visits Palestine before World War I and says, if, you know, if we continue selling lands to the Jews and they continue expanding, then the whole thing is lost. And the Ottoman government is neglecting this. So perhaps there's another circle of both like Palestinian writings in Arabic, but also kind of a transnational or transregional circle that includes, you know, people like Najib Azul and others that kind of bypass the Ottomans and kind of come from more Arabist circles, or Palestine Arab.
Yeah, so the first question is an interesting note. The Ottoman parliamentarian from Baghdad, Sassou, was not in with this club. He was very suspicious of Zionists.
Oh, he said, he's like, I don't have anything
Exactly.
in common with Ashkenazi Jews, so we can.
Yeah, with that and with the movement or with anything, and the idea that we should be teaching our kids in Arabic schools and remain that. Yeah, if you look at the interview in Ha'olam, the Zionist press, you read Nissim Mazliak's interview and then you read his interview, it's a stark difference. So that I don't really touch upon this because I've never seen it coming from there. I was very surprised to see about Malul and Moyal. You know, Malul was 16, 17 years old when he's writing in the Egyptian press. Moyal was already much older, who had lived all over. Esther was a star, it seems, in Egypt, and I think when she came to Palestine, she was extremely depressed that she's not able to express herself, A, in Hebrew, and B, as a woman. She felt she was pushed out. And yes, the Ottoman parliamentarian in Nazareth and in Damascus, who was one of the ones killed, of course I forgot his name right now, huge. He executed in the square, you know. He was staunchly anti-Zionist. They were also anti-CUP. So a lot of the Arab groups that were in the surrounding areas were anti-CUP, but Ruhi al-Khalidi, Said al-Husseini, they're the CUP. And that's really what that's that question I want to ask, like why are you still so staunchly pro-government if you know this is happening? The fact that there was a sense of peril, absolutely. Across the board I see it. They from whether the Arabic press, I'm just now getting into the Arabic press outside of Palestine, is on fire on this issue. They don't believe for a second that this is possible what Malul is saying. See, the thing is that Malul and the Moyals, and together with all the Ashkenazis, saying, what damage are we doing here? We're a small people, we're 10% to 15%. Why are we such a big threat? And that's why I say you have to put in this idea that they're leaving. You have to look at high birth and high death, birth death, infant mortality rates that are quite high. So the Palestinians say, yes, they are a threat. And they're trying to say this. Arthur Rupin talks about the infant mortality later on, very early on. So there is this idea that they're going to get the majority, but the sense of them separating from the Arab population, that really sends fear. So this really sort of answers your question also. You know, if they weren't separating, but they're saying we should teach Hebrew as our first language. Second language is going to be Osmanli, because they need it for the state. And then Arabic. But come on, when parents say we first have to teach our kids Hebrew, then Ottoman, and then Arabic. Now, of course, this wasn't the case in Cairo. This wasn't the case in Baghdad. In Istanbul, it's Turkish. It was different. That was a whole debate. I think there was one time I think a few editions came out. I never found it. In a Turkish paper that comes out, but it's in Hebrew characters in Izmir. They said we're going to now write in a Turkish paper, and like 2 editions came out in Hebrew characters. You know, the idea of giving these characters is so it's but it's very different. These are Arabic-speaking Jews, and they see themselves as Arabs. That doesn't mean that they're going to be closer to the Arab population, but you're right. They pleaded, saying we are not separatists, right? Malud, in all his correspondence with other Arabs, he's saying that we're sincere. So yeah.
Yes.
In the second conclusion here, you write that the post-Balfour Declaration Arab historians recount complexities of the region. So me, like you're making a claim that they are basically writing out the complexities of their own identity because the Arab historians are writing about Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, at least the one, for example. Don't you think that it makes more sense to say that post the Balfour Declaration they felt the need to stick together and to show their identity more than it makes sense to say that they were writing out the complexities that exist, which also pulls back to when I asked about Egypt. Don't you think that it makes more sense to say that instead of asking Egypt why they shifted into the civic kind of encapsulation of the Jews and the Zionist movement to fighting them in 1948, don't you think it makes more sense to ask yourself why this shift happened suddenly out of nowhere?
No, I think when I talk about the way they write history, I mean, obviously nationalists are going to write history in a nationalist way, right? So during the following World War One, it's under occupation, British French occupation. The idea that Palestinians see this idea of being part of southern Syria, Syria Junubia, or representation in the parliament, it makes complete sense because they didn't have this idea of to begin with, they didn't have an idea of an independent state, right? You don't have this. So you have local identities. What I'm saying is that, you have this idea of Arab history. We're now in the post from a long time. So, but the idea that, we're all one, and we're all, everything was, the colonial powers gave us this identity of Lebanon, Syria, and Palestinianism. That's what I'm talking about. The first time I was attacked ever, and very few times when I've been attacked on that stage, when a professor says, you're drunk from your Ottoman sources. That's what he says. You're drunk from your Ottoman sources. And then he said, and he was so upset and I thought he was going to be upset, people would be upset about the Zionism part. He was upset that I was calling them Palestinians and they were saying we're Palestinian. That's what I'm talking about, right? It was this idea that we were all one Arab people and the colonial powers separated us, gave us this identity, right? And I'm saying that there were local identities before. Of course, it's gone in leaps and bounds since what I'm talking about. The professor was in his then 70s. That was like 15 years ago. So maybe I had that in mind a bit. Yeah, there was a question back there also.
Thank you. Just fascinating. It really helps to clear up all the various conspiracy theories out there. Makes you realize how much more you have to study yourself. And didn't you mention at some point the Masonic lodges and a particular role that they played? That especially was just so refreshing to hear, because I feel like it's very rarely spoken about it in academic circles. Just what is legit and what is, of course, more theories, more conspiracy theory and outlandish, and where they may meet or not meet. I like to typically study that myself, and I hope to find a grad school that will accommodate